Welcome to the group. Before I introduce our program, I just want to recognize our guests, John Zachow, a board member, Tom Seedlars, a finance committee member and a long-term board member, Mike Mathiasen, New England chapter president, right, Mike? Yeah. So thank you very much for coming. Also, Sue Drummond, thank you for making the trip again. I don't know how many Clockwindings you've been to, but
I've lost count.
all right, it's been a few.
Yeah.
So thank you for making the trip with John. We appreciate it. So at this point, I'll turn it to John. Thank you for making the time for this again. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, before we get into the, let's call it the more formal part of this thing, when Steve asked me to say a couple words, I realized that this was going to take place a rather momentous day. 75 years ago on 6 June, British and American forces landed in Normandy, and I said, you know, I wonder what was going on 12 June 75 years ago today. So without spending tons of time on it, Montgomery's Second Army was working their way toward Villers-Bocage on the road to Caen. And as a little side note, they were having a really tough slug of it because most of the German panzers were on their left flank. So they were having a really tough slug of the thing. The U.S. 502nd, 506 Parachute Group of the 101st Airborne, they took control of about half of Carrollton. That's where the cemetery is today above Utah and Omaha Beach. The U.S. armies that landed at Utah and Omaha linked up. So now they had a solid 5 bridgehead front of about 80 kilometers wide, 10 to 30 kilometers deep. I mean, they were there, not going anywhere. Midnight on 12 June, there were 18 divisions on the ground at Normandy. Now, on D-Day, on the anniversary of D-Day, I watched The Longest Day. And if one was to watch that movie, one would assume, yeah, the British were there, the Canadians were there, but it was the Americans. Well, just for the record, we had 8 divisions. The British and Canadians had 10. Okay? That's sometimes, I think, maybe not intentionally, but it's overlooked. And a couple other interesting statistics. There was 327,000 men on the beach fighting. They had 54,000 vehicles in that little bridgehead, and they had moved over 105,000 tons of supplies in a mere 6 days. You know, and you start to think about what it took, because it wasn't just drive it over. I mean, they had to load it, they had to take it across the water, they had to unload it. It's a big deal. Now then, that brings us to our clock winding. And before I introduce our clock winder, I got into a little bit of a history search, and I was curious, and I've always been curious as to why the clock was presented. And I have thought for a long time that it was because there was a direct connect between certain wire industry executives, people, whatever, companies here in the U.S. and their counterparts in England, and it was a matter of those people thanking the Americans for helping them directly. And then I read the synopsis that was written on the 50th anniversary of the clock winding, and I kind of, well, it sounds more like it was just these British wire folks wanted to recognize the fact that America had helped Britain in their darkest hour. Well, let me read some, excuse me. Let me read something. I'm reading from the 1948 account of the presentation. At this luncheon, Mr. John Rigby, Director John Rigby and Sons, Bradford, England, on behalf of the British members, now this is important, British members of the Wire Association. Okay? It's been international for a long time. Presented to the Wire Association an early English grandfather clock as a token of appreciation for services rendered by the Wire Association to their members in Great Britain and as a gesture of friendship from our British members. And there's a couple of photographs. One photograph of the clock and one of John Rigby doing the presentation, which is my way to segue into introducing Lindsay Millington, Under Warden of the Worshipful Company of Tin Platers, alias Wire Workers, one of the historic livery companies of London. She is due to be installed as master in July next year during the company's 350th anniversary year, and she will be the first lady to hold that office. Lindsay has been associated with the wire industry for 30 years. She was chief executive of MetSkill, UK Metals Industries Skills Council from 1990 to 2005, and was instrumental in launching the WireLink Exchange program with the Wire Association and the UK Clockwinders. She's also been Director General of British Metals Recycling Association, is now a freelance art historian, lives in Cambridge, England, and enjoys music, cinema, and walking the coast beach. And I heard a rumor you walked the beach this morning, or while you were
I did, briefly.
Okay.
Briefly.
And with that, Lindsay,
Yeah.
floor
Thank
is
you, John.
yours.
I don't know that I can be as slick as that, but thank you, John. But thank you for the introduction, because what you were bringing back was my father was amongst the British troops landing in the D-Day landings. In fact, he got made up from lieutenant to captain in the process, because the captain had fallen down on the boat, on the transit boat, and broken his leg. So it's very important, a bit of history in my family. But being here today with you all is well, it's a great privilege. I suspect, looking back at all these familiar faces and unfamiliar faces, I think everybody says that, but it is really, isn't it? To keep this tradition going with the historic clock. And 70 years, I think. Am I the 71st?
70th.
70th.
One mess in between.
70th is even better.
Yeah.
That's really good. And I think the second lady that's wound the clock. So one way or another, the ladies are getting into the industry.
That's right.
Keep going, girls. I look through, as one should, but you have it on the wall as well, the list of the people that have wound the clock over the years. And it really is a who's who of the people that have worked in the wire industry in the UK, and also a directory of the companies. And lots of old friends, and I've seen many of them looking a lot younger on there than I've ever been. Peter Rigby particularly. Many old friends, and it's sad that so many of them are no longer with us. And I'd say that both the individuals and also the companies too. You know, the names change over the years, but the tradition carries on. And the tradition clearly has been very important as a Hands Across the Sea initiative. And I know from talking to the clockwinders over the years in the UK that it's brought lots of lasting friendships with several of you in the room, and also I'm quite sure some useful commercial links as well, which is what trade is all about. So it's my pleasure to join that list, and I notice I'm on the list already, so I could leave quickly, and then you'd have a problem. My links with the wire industry, I can claim they go back to the very beginning of the 20th century, when my great-grandfather Edmund Millington ran a shop with a workshop behind it, and over the shop it said ironmonger and whitesmith. Now you'll say, well, that makes her a tin plate worker, but in the workshop at the back, as well as things working with tin plate, he also made wire-spoked bicycle wheels. And by repute, and I need to spend some time, I need somebody like John to ferret this out for me, but by repute he made the bicycle wheels for a man called Mr. Bill Morris, who went on to make things like the Morris 1000 car and the Morris 10 car, and cars that are very famous in the UK, but I don't know if they got over here. But he became very significant in the car making industry. But we made bicycle wheels, that was about it. My link started with being recruited in 1990 to set up an organisation called Steel Training, which later became MetSkill. It was an employer-led body to improve skills and productivity across the metals industry, originally set up by the steel producers, but it took, I think, less than a year for the wire industry to come along and join us. Led by Geoffrey Firth, and I'm sure like me, many of you remember Geoffrey, sadly departed. I did have a note of when he wound the clock, 1979. I don't know if he appears on the film. But together through that organisation, we did, I think, some important things, particularly reintroducing apprenticeships to the industry, introducing new vocational qualifications that worked for people on the shop floor, often people in their 50s that have been there forever and had never been recognised at all, and also working on process improvement techniques and team working and general ways of getting the workers in the businesses engaged and generally becoming more productive as a result. In the late 90s, so after I'd been there for about 10 years, I had a little delegation came to see me. And that was Geoffrey Firth, Dill Scrivens from Tinsley Wire, who wound the clock, as my notes tell me, in 1973, and Peter Rigby, of whom we've been speaking today. And I think you all know Peter Rigby. He seems to have wound the clock several times and indeed be part of the family that's run right through from the very beginning. And they were all people I knew from the industry, but I knew nothing at all about your good selves or the clock. And they came along to say, would I help them set up the UK end of a new exchange for young managers that was going to be called WireLink, with this organisation in the United States called the Wire Association International. And game for anything that was interesting, as we were saying earlier. I said yes, and as a result of that found myself writing the first calling notice, if you like, out into the wire industry to say, have you got any young managers you'd like to put forward for competition for the place for our exchange, and along the way writing about a clock. And that was my first knowledge of this magnificent clock. This is the first day I've seen it, but that was the first time I'd heard about it. And that's getting on for 20 years ago, almost 20 years. Maybe next year will be the 20th anniversary, yes, I think, of the exchange. So I'm proud that I've been associated with Wire Association International and indeed the WireLink Exchange Programme now for nearly 20 years. Together, I think we've identified some pretty exceptional young managers. And I was struck by how your winner last year described the experience. He said it was educational, motivating, and overwhelming. And I think if he'd been not feeling that he should be polite, he'd probably have said exhausting as well, because when I look at the programme that's been put together by people like Steve and John in the USA, or the programme that latterly has been put together by Bev Page in the UK, they must go home pretty tired, I think. Perhaps an appropriate time to give you Bev Page's good wishes. I had hoped that he would be here this year to wind the clock, but unfortunately, for family reasons, it's difficult for him to travel, but I know he would very much have liked to do that at some point. It's been my delight to meet, I think, maybe most of the 9 US scholars that have travelled to the UK, and most recently to welcome back James Curry, who had a great programme, I understand, led by John's son, and he was welcomed back to the UK by coming to our court dinner of the Worshipful Company of Tin Plate Workers, alias Wire Workers, in the City of London, and I'm not going to say it all again. And I was delighted to learn just this morning that he's applied to become a yeoman of our company, which is a new category that we've brought in quite recently for younger people to get them involved. So that's a really good news, and that's only this morning that I picked that up on the email. It was the WireLink Exchange and awards that we set up in a similar way for the Metals Industry Apprentice of the Year in the UK that introduced me to the livery company, the Tin Plate Workers, alias Wire Workers, of which I hadn't heard either when they came along with their delegation. And I became a liveryman of the company in the year 2000, which I think is the same year that our first winner, Simon Mounsey, came over to the States. And it would have been roughly the same time of year. And I'd had the pleasure of being involved in interviewing him. So it was quite a busy year. And now, getting on for 20 years later, I find myself Under Warden of the company, which is like being assistant to the master, one of the officers, and nominated to become master in July next year. I'll follow that there Lawrence Mutkin, who wound the clock last year, who will become our master this summer. So we're getting a bit of a tradition. And I think if I were to look down that list, I would find a lot of people through the years who've been master of the livery company, who've also been clockwinders. As I think John mentioned, 2020 will be our 350th anniversary. It was in 1670 that the livery company was awarded its royal charter by Charles II. I think that makes us about 100 years older than the clock case. Is that? But just to give you a
Yes.
feel, and I've just had a very interesting break in Boston, and I was spotting 1670s around.
Yeah.
I think the one I found particularly was the foundation of the Old South Church in Boston, the Protestant reformers setting that up in 1670. So just sort of places it in the history book. We're going to have a whole load of celebrations next year, because that's what having an anniversary is all about. And one of the particular ones will be at the Guildhall, which is the main building within the City of London. And we're going to have that as a big anniversary dinner, which we're going to do jointly with the Company of Wheelwrights and the Company of Pattern Makers, which I can spell for you later. Pattern makers, out of interest, are not people who make engineering patterns. They are people who made, and I don't think anybody uses them anymore, but the wooden sort of clog that went underneath the ladies' shoes to keep them out of the mud. So there was a whole Worshipful company of the pattern makers. But they were both also granted their royal charter in 1670, so we're going to have a big event, because that way we will fill the whole of Guildhall. And Steve, we will send you a couple of invitations to that, and if it suits for you and whoever you feel would be appropriate, because I see so many interesting faces
Right.
around the room,
Everyone
then
wants
we
to
will
go.
be delighted to
Send
see
20
a couple of you at
invitations.
our dinner there, and that would be another way to cement our friendship, I think. Livery companies, just a final word, in the City of London, obviously where we can, we maintain our links with the trade, and things like WAI Link and our apprentice awards and so forth are very good examples of that. But trades change, and the role of associations and things change, and few of us these days are what we would call a trade association. They exist separately. So these days livery companies are mainly about education and charity. They're about history, which I know appeals to John, and they're about good fellowship. I think we're doing pretty well together on those. On the education and charity, we've both spoken about the WAI Link exchange. In terms of history, I brought a couple of little things to add to your history there. The first of which is, I don't know if anybody previously has given you a copy of our history book.
No, we have not.
It has been published now for a number of years, so that's very remiss of them if they haven't. And you haven't actually got this one on your wall. I notice you have a very fine certificate, but I thought you might like to have our company arms
Yeah.
to put on your wall as well.
Yeah, that's very nice. Thank
The
you.
company arms have a little bit of a story in that we have been using those since 1670. And the motto at the bottom you'll see says, Amore Sitis Unite. Now, where are the gentlemen that had such ease in translating the Latin over here? Roughly translated, it means united in friendship, which I think is a very good reason for presenting it to you. But I'm told by our clerk that it was only in the 20th century that we realised we hadn't registered the coat of arms with the College of Arms in London, and therefore we've been using it illegally for something like 300 years. But they are now legal arms. You'll be pleased to have that. So
That's important to us.
education, charity, history, and fellowship. And for me, being here with you this evening is very much about fellowship. So, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. So we
that's fine.
wind.
Yes.
If I get a photo of you with a client facing this way, so we get
Right.
It'll be good. Yeah.
This is where you catch me if
I
I
know.
fall off.
But if you,
I just get nervous of the stools a little.
You get nervous with the clock, is
if
what
before
you
you
should
start, you just stay, face this way, so we
This
can,
way?
we get
Should
your
we-
face
should we hold
head
it
on
with
looking.
that?
Yes, that'd be
be.
perfect.
We can be a left-handed winder. Right, and is it clockwise? Is that a silly question? I am a right-handed person. How many times does it go around?
Only 4,000.
400? 500?
One more turn.
Oh, well, for good luck.
There you go.
Right.
That's perfect.
I know it's only 6 months since Lawrence won it, isn't it? Yes.
Oh, may I get a picture holding those items? Because this is the first time someone's brought something like that. I mean, I'm
Is it?
amazing,
Bringing gifts.
Right.
especially the one on the wall, that's excellent.
Here, John, why don't you come forward if you
John is the one for the history.
Right.
Well, take it out of the box is probably a good thing
Yeah.
to do. But I've been travelling around, so it had to stay in the box, really.
There you go.
Yes. Hmm.
Here, all of a sudden, okay. I'm over there.